Motivation feels powerful when it arrives, but fragile when it leaves. And if you've ever felt intensely driven for a few days only to crash back into inertia, you might have concluded that you lack discipline, that you are inconsistent, or that you simply do not want success badly enough. Yet the truth is more uncomfortable and more liberating at the same time. The disappearance of motivation is rarely a moral failure and almost always a psychological pattern playing out beneath your awareness. Because motivation is not a stable personality trait, but a fluctuating neurochemical and cognitive state shaped by expectations, identity, and feedback loops in your brain. When you start something new, whether it is a fitness routine, a business project, a study plan, or a personal transformation goal, your brain does not simply respond to the objective value of the goal, it responds to the anticipated reward. And that anticipation is powered by dopamine, which is often misunderstood as the pleasure molecule but is more accurately described as the molecule of pursuit, prediction, and expectation. Dopamine spikes not when you receive the reward but when you expect it. And this is where the first trap is set, because when you imagine your future success, you are not neutrally visualizing, you are constructing an exaggerated simulation filled with emotional intensity, social validation, and identity elevation, and your brain reacts to that simulation as if progress is already happening. This creates what can be called a dopamine expectation gap, the difference between the intense chemical anticipation you feel at the beginning and the slow, messy, and perfect reality that follows. And the larger the fantasy, the larger the gap, which means the crash is not evidence of weakness, but evidence that your expectations were inflated beyond what daily action can immediately supply. Think about the first day you decide to change your life. You clean your desk, download productivity apps, outline a plan, maybe even announce your intention publicly. And in that moment, your brain is flooded with dopamine because the promise of transformation feels imminent. But by day 3 or 4, the novelty fades. The results are invisible. The effort feels heavier. And suddenly, the same goal that felt electrifying now feels draining. And you interpret that shift as a loss of motivation when in fact it is a recalibration of expectation meeting reality. The brain is constantly making predictions about the future and comparing them to outcomes, and when the predicted reward does not match the actual feedback, a reward prediction error occurs. If the outcome is better than expected, dopamine increases and reinforces the behavior. But if the outcome is worse than expected, dopamine drops, and this drop feels like discouragement, boredom, or apathy. Most people unknowingly sabotage their own motivation by setting goals that are emotionally cinematic but structurally vague, which means the brain cannot receive small, consistent signals of progress. Instead, it waits for a dramatic payoff, and while it waits, it loses interest. You might say you want to get in shape, but what does it mean neurologically? What specific behavior gets reinforced today? What measurable feedback tells your brain that the effort was worth it? And if the answer is unclear, the dopamine system remains underfed. This is why discipline feels like it fails you, because you are trying to rely on a feeling that was never designed to be permanent. And when that feeling fades, you think the solution is to push harder, chain yourself more, consume more motivational content, or search for a new goal that excites you again. But this only restarts the same cycle, intense anticipation followed by inevitable deflation. The deeper issue often lies in identity mismatch, the silent conflict between who you believe you are and what you are trying to do. If your self concept is I am someone who struggles to stay consistent, or I am not naturally disciplined, or even I am the type of person who always starts strong and quits, then every moment of difficulty reinforces that identity, because your brain seeks coherence more than success. And if succeeding would require you to abandon a familiar identity, even a negative one, part of you will resist. Identity operates as a filter for motivation. When a behavior aligns with your self image, it feels natural and sustainable, but when it clashes, it feels forced and fragile. For example, if you attempt to adopt the habits of a high performer while internally identifying as someone chaotic or unfocused, each disciplined action feels like an impersonation rather than an expression of self, and impersonations are exhausting to maintain. This is why people often experience a surge of motivation when they commit to a new version of themselves, because they momentarily suspend their old identity and step into a new narrative. But if that narrative is not reinforced by repeated evidence, the old identity quietly reasserts itself. The brain prefers consistency of self over achievement of goals. It would rather be predictably mediocre than unpredictably excellent, because predictability feels safe. When motivation disappears, it is often not because the goal is meaningless, but because the identity foundation beneath it is unstable. And without identity support, goals feel like external pressure rather than internal alignment. There is also a structural misunderstanding in how people approach goals versus systems. Goals are outcome focused and emotionally charged, while systems are process focused and structurally boring. And motivation thrives on emotional charge, but sustainability thrives on structure. When you obsess over the goal, you condition your brain to care only about the future result, which means the present action feels like a sacrifice rather than a reward, and sacrifice is tolerable only for short bursts. If your entire motivation depends on seeing the scale drop, the subscriber count rise, the revenue increase, or the recognition appear, then every day without visible progress feels like failure, and the reward prediction error accumulates until the brain concludes that the effort is not worth the cost. A system, however, reframes the reward. Instead of waiting for the outcome, it reinforces the completion of the behavior itself, meaning the dopamine signal is attached to the action rather than the distant result. This shift sounds simple but is psychologically profound because it reduces the expectation gap and stabilizes reinforcement. Most people try to increase motivation when what they actually need is to reduce volatility. High peaks feel inspiring, but they create deep valleys, and the nervous system is not designed to operate at peak arousal indefinitely. There is also the hidden role of cognitive load and motivation loss. When you set ambitious goals, you often underestimate the mental friction involved in execution, decision making, planning, and error correction, and each micro decision drains cognitive resources, which means even if you care deeply about the goal, your brain may simply be fatigued. Decision fatigue compounds this issue because the more choices you must make about when, how, and what to do, the more likely you are to default to easier, more immediately rewarding behaviors. In this context, losing motivation is not a collapse of willpower but a predictable response to an environment that demands more cognitive effort than it provides in feedback. You might notice that motivation tends to be highest when clarity is highest. When you know exactly what to do next, the barrier is low. But when ambiguity dominates, procrastination increases. Ambiguity amplifies the expectation gap because you cannot predict reward accurately, and when prediction is uncertain, dopamine signaling weakens. The modern world exacerbates this pattern by providing constant short term rewards through notifications, entertainment, and social media, which recalibrate your dopamine baseline. When your brain becomes accustomed to rapid, unpredictable rewards, slow progress toward a long term goal feels disproportionately dull. This does not mean you're addicted or broken. It means your reward system adapts to the most frequently reinforced stimuli, and if quick rewards dominate your environment, deep work will feel comparatively understimulating. Therefore, when you begin a meaningful but slow moving project, your brain compares it not to neutral baseline but to high intensity digital stimuli, and the discrepancy magnifies the perception of boredom. Boredom itself is not the absence of desire, but the presence of unmet expectation. It is the brain signaling that the predicted reward is insufficient relative to the effort. If you interpret boredom as a sign that you chose the wrong path, you will constantly switch directions, chasing novelty to recreate the initial dopamine spike. But novelty is not progress, it is simply another expectation surge waiting to crash. Understanding this pattern changes the narrative from I am lazy to my reward system is misaligned with my strategy, which is a technical problem rather than a character flaw. The most dangerous moment in the motivation cycle is not when you feel tired, but when you feel disappointed. Because disappointment carries meaning, it tells a story that you expected more, that you imagined faster growth, that you believed this time would be different. And when reality fails to meet the narrative, the emotional drop can feel like betrayal. Yet the drop is evidence that you cared, that you invested belief into the outcome, and belief amplifies expectation. If you want motivation to last longer, you must learn to moderate expectation without killing ambition, which means designing goals that are emotionally compelling but structurally incremental. Instead of asking how to stay motivated, The more precise question is how to engineer smaller, more frequent wins that close the dopamine expectation gap. This involves breaking outcomes into behavior so small that completion is almost guaranteed, because completion itself becomes the reward, and as completion accumulates, identity begins to shift from I am trying to I am someone who follows through. That shift is subtle but transformative. Because identity driven behavior requires less motivational force, it becomes congruent rather than aspirational. You do not need to feel inspired to act in alignment with who you believe you are. You act because it would feel strange not to. The first step in escaping the cycle of lost motivation is recognizing that the initial surge was never meant to carry the entire journey. It was a spark, not a fuel tank. When the spark fades, it does not mean the fire is impossible. It means you need structure, feedback, and identity reinforcement. The paradox is that sustainable motivation often feels less dramatic than temporary bursts. It feels calm, almost ordinary, because it is grounded in predictable reinforcement rather than emotional intensity. If you stop chasing the feeling of motivation and start designing conditions that reduce expectation gaps, clarify next actions, and align behavior with identity, you begin to experience a quieter but more durable form of drive. Losing motivation quickly is not proof that you lack discipline. It is evidence that your brain is responding logically to mismatched predictions, unstable identity narratives, and inconsistent reinforcement. When you understand that, you stop attacking yourself and start adjusting the system, and that shift from self-blame to system design is where real change begins. If the first phase of motivation loss is driven by the dopamine expectation gap, the second phase is driven by how your brain interprets that gap and integrates it into your identity. Because once the initial excitement fades and reality sets in, you are no longer reacting to the goal itself, but to the story you construct about the fading feeling, and that story determines whether you recalibrate or retreat. When progress slows or feels invisible, most people unconsciously personalize the drop in dopamine. They translate a neurochemical adjustment into a character judgment, and this is where discipline appears to fail, not because discipline is ineffective, but because it is being asked to compensate for a distorted internal narrative. The brain is constantly updating its internal model of who you are, and it does so based on repeated evidence. If you begin a project with intensity and then disengage when the excitement declines, the brain logs that pattern as proof of inconsistency, and over time this pattern becomes part of your identity architecture. Identity is not a fixed truth. It is a prediction model about your future behavior built from past repetitions. And if the model predicts that you will lose interest after the novelty fades, your motivation system will adjust accordingly, conserving energy because it anticipates abandonment. This is why repeated cycles of starting and stopping make it harder to sustain future efforts. You are not just losing momentum, you are training your brain to expect collapse. The concept of reward prediction error becomes more complex here because it is no longer only about external outcomes but about internal self-expectations. When you tell yourself this time will be different, you are raising the predicted reward not just of the goal but of your own performance. And if your behavior does not meet that prediction, the negative error signal is amplified by shame. Shame is metabolically expensive. It narrows attention, increases stress, and often pushes you toward short-term relief behaviors, which provide immediate dopamine spikes that temporarily mask the discomfort of perceived failure. This creates a secondary loop layered on top of the original expectation gap. You feel disappointed. You seek relief. The relief reinforces avoidance, and avoidance further validates the identity of inconsistency. Over time, motivation is no longer just fragile. It becomes threatening because starting something new now carries the risk of repeating the familiar cycle. You may notice subtle resistance when considering a new commitment, a quiet internal voice that says you will probably quit again. And that voice is not sabotage in a dramatic sense, it is predictive efficiency. Your brain is trying to protect you from expending energy on an outcome it predicts will not materialize. Protection and limitation often feel identical from the inside. Another layer of this pattern involves identity mismatch at a deeper level than habits. Many goals are chosen not from intrinsic alignment but from comparison, social pressure, or idealized self-images constructed from external standards. If your goal is rooted in who you think you should be rather than who you genuinely value being, Motivation will spike when external validation is salient and collapse when validation is absent. For example, if you pursue productivity because you admire high achievers and want to see yourself as one, the motivation surge is tied to the imagined status and recognition associated with that identity. But the daily process of quiet and glamorous work may not resonate with your intrinsic interests, and the misalignment creates friction that no amount of willpower can sustainably override. Identity mismatch drains energy because it requires constant self suppression. You are attempting to override natural inclinations rather than channel them. Sustainable drive emerges when behavior expresses identity rather than contradicts it. And this requires honest self inquiry about what you actually value versus what you believe would make you worthy. Many people confuse admiration with desire. They admire the outcomes of others but do not desire the process required to achieve them. And when confronted with the repetitive, often monotonous nature of progress, the brain recalculates the costs and reduces dopamine signaling accordingly. This recalculation is rational. The problem is not that motivation disappears, but that the original decision was made under emotional amplification without cost awareness. Emotional amplification at the beginning of the goal obscures friction. Friction includes time constraints, competing responsibilities, skill gaps, and emotional discomfort, and when these frictions become visible, they feel like unexpected obstacles rather than predictable components of growth. The gap between imagined ease and actual difficulty widens the reward prediction error and accelerates disengagement. A crucial shift occurs when you reinterpret friction not as evidence that the goal is wrong but as data that your system design is incomplete. Goals fail when they depend on fluctuating states. Systems succeed when they reduce reliance on fluctuating states. A system accounts for low energy days, distractions, mood variability, and cognitive fatigue, while a motivation based approach assumes consistent internal drive. If your plan only works when you feel inspired, it is not a plan, it is a wish. The brain favors efficiency, and when a behavior requires excessive conscious effort each time, it will search for shortcuts. Habits exist to reduce cognitive load, and without habit scaffolding, you are forcing your prefrontal cortex to override automatic tendencies repeatedly, which is unsustainable under stress. This is why designing environmental cues and reducing decision friction matters more than trying to amplify emotional intensity. Consider how much motivation is lost not because the task is difficult, but because the initiation cost is high, unclear next steps, disorganized materials, or ambiguous standards create micro-resistances that accumulate into avoidance. Each micro-resistance subtly increases the perceived effort-to-reward ratio, and dopamine signaling adjusts downward accordingly. When the effort feels disproportionately high relative to expected payoff, disengagement is the logical outcome. There is also the phenomenon of temporal discounting, where the brain values immediate rewards more heavily than distant ones, and this bias intensifies under stress or fatigue. If your goal's primary reward is months away, your brain discounts its value dramatically in the present moment, especially when immediate alternatives are available. Without intermediate reinforcement, long-term goals compete poorly against short-term stimuli. The solution is not to eliminate long-term ambition, but to engineer proximal rewards that are intrinsically tied to the behavior itself. This might include tracking streaks, celebrating micro-completions, or deliberately noticing skill improvement. But the key is that the reward must be immediate enough to counter temporal discounting. Another overlooked factor in rapid motivation loss is emotional mislabeling. What you call lack of motivation may actually be anxiety about inadequacy, fear of evaluation, or discomfort with uncertainty. The brain often interprets threat signals as aversion, and aversion is experienced subjectively as a drop in drive. If a project exposes you to potential criticism or forces you to confront a skill gap, the emotional cost increases, and unless you consciously differentiate between boredom and fear, you may assume the goal no longer matters when in reality it matters enough to activate vulnerability. Vulnerability is metabolically demanding, and the brain will reduce dopamine pursuit signals if the anticipated emotional cost outweighs predicted reward. This is particularly common when goals are public. Social exposure amplifies both potential validation and potential rejection, making the prediction system more volatile. When you experience early success, Dopamine surges reinforce continued effort, but when feedback is neutral or negative, the drop is sharper because social evaluation is deeply tied to survival circuitry. If your motivation depends heavily on external response metrics such as likes, comments, or recognition, your internal reward system becomes unstable, oscillating with external variability. Stability requires internal metrics that you control, such as effort consistency or skill practice duration, because controllable metrics produce more predictable reinforcement. As identity begins to shift through repeated small completions, something subtle happens. The expectation gap narrows because your predictions about yourself become more accurate and grounded. Instead of imagining a dramatic transformation, you expect incremental improvement, and when incremental improvement occurs, the reward prediction error becomes positive rather than negative. This does not produce explosive excitement, but it produces quiet satisfaction, and quiet satisfaction is sustainable. The cultural narrative around motivation often glorifies intensity, hustle, and relentless drive, but intensity is metabolically expensive and neurologically unstable. A more accurate model of long-term progress resembles steady calibration rather than emotional peaks. If you repeatedly expose yourself to realistic friction and survive it, your brain updates its model, predicting that you can tolerate discomfort, and this prediction increases resilience because the anticipated cost decreases over time. What initially felt overwhelming becomes normalized through repetition, and as perceived cost decreases, the effort to reward ratio improves without changing the external goal. This is why starting extremely small can paradoxically accelerate progress. It minimizes prediction error and builds evidence that sustains identity transformation. When you set goals that are just slightly beyond your current capacity, you create manageable positive prediction errors that reinforce behavior, whereas setting goals far beyond capacity produces repeated negative errors that erode motivation. The speed at which you lose motivation is therefore not a reflection of desire but a reflection of how often your predictions are violated. If you consistently overestimate how much you can do in a short time and underestimate how long meaningful change takes, you will experience chronic negative prediction errors. The antidote is not lowering ambition but refining calibration. Ambition defines direction, calibration defines sustainability. When calibration improves, you stop oscillating between extremes of overcommitment and withdrawal, and motivation stabilizes because your brain trusts your plans. Trust in self is built through accurate promises kept, not grand promises broken. Each time you follow through on a modest commitment, you reinforce an identity of reliability, and reliability reduces internal resistance because the brain expects continuity rather than collapse. In this way, discipline stops feeling like a force applied against yourself and begins to feel like alignment with the self-image you have proven through action. Losing motivation quickly is a symptom of miscalibrated expectations, identity incongruence, managed emotional costs, and poorly designed reinforcement structures. And once you see these variables clearly, the problem shifts from self-condemnation to strategic adjustment. The question is no longer why you cannot stay motivated, but how you can design an environment, an identity that makes sustained action the predictable outcome rather than the heroic exception. By the time you reach the third phase of understanding why motivation disappears so quickly, the question is no longer what is wrong with you, but how do you redesign your internal and external architecture so that motivation becomes a byproduct rather than a requirement. Because the ultimate mistake people make is believing that sustained action must be fueled by sustained intensity, when in reality sustained action is fueled by reduced friction, accurate prediction, identity reinforcement, and emotionally tolerable progress. The shift that changes everything is moving from motivation-dependent behavior to structure-dependent behavior. Motivation is volatile because it is state-based. Structure is stable because it is decision-based. When you rely on how you feel in the moment, you are placing control in a system governed by sleep quality, stress levels, social feedback, hormonal fluctuations, and environmental stimuli, all of which change daily. But when you rely on structure, you pre-commit to behaviors in advance and remove the need for emotional negotiation. Emotional negotiation is the hidden tax that drains consistency. Every time you wake up and ask yourself whether you feel like doing the task, you are reopening the expectation gap conversation, inviting doubt, recalculating effort, and reevaluating reward. And this constant recalculation increases the probability of avoidance. A powerful strategy is to reduce the number of daily negotiations by converting key behaviors into non-negotiable identity expressions, meaning you do them not because you feel driven, but because not doing them would conflict with who you have decided to be. Identity-based action stabilizes dopamine signaling because the predicted reward is no longer tied to outcome magnitude but to identity congruence. The reward becomes the alignment itself. When you complete a behavior that confirms your chosen identity, even if the external result is small, your brain registers coherence, and coherence is neurologically satisfying. This is why small, consistent actions performed in alignment with a clear identity can feel more energizing than sporadic, intense efforts disconnected from self-concept. However, identity does not shift through affirmation alone, it shifts through evidence accumulation. You cannot think your way into a new identity. You must act your way into it repeatedly until the prediction model updates. The brain learns through pattern recognition, and when it observes repeated follow-through, it adjusts its expectation of future behavior upward, which reduces internal resistance because it anticipates continuity. Resistance is often the brain's memory of past inconsistency. When you have a history of abandoning projects, each new commitment triggers a protective skepticism. But as you build a history of modest reliability, that skepticism fades. Reliability is built through commitment small enough to survive low motivation days. If your plan collapses whenever you feel tired or stressed, the plan is too fragile. The goal is not to design a routine that works at your peak, but one that works at your baseline. This requires brutal honesty about your real energy levels, distractions, and emotional patterns. Many people design plans for an idealized future self with unlimited focus, then feel confused when their present self fails to execute. The gap between imagined capacity and actual capacity widens the reward prediction error and reinforces the narrative of inadequacy. Instead, design for the version of you that exists on an average Tuesday afternoon, mildly distracted, slightly fatigued, and emotionally neutral. If that version can succeed, consistency compounds. Another crucial adjustment is reframing the concept of progress. Most people evaluate progress in terms of visible outcomes, but the brain is more responsive to perceived control and skill acquisition than to distant results. When you track controllable metrics, such as time spent practicing, repetitions completed, or iterations shipped, you provide the brain with immediate feedback that effort produced measurable movement. This closes the dopamine expectation gap because the predicted reward becomes realistic and frequent. If you only reward yourself when major milestones occur, you create long reinforcement droughts, and during droughts, the brain reallocates energy to more immediately rewarding behaviors. Reinforcement frequency matters more than reinforcement intensity. A small win repeated daily outperforms a dramatic win experienced sporadically. There is also a deeper emotional layer that must be addressed: your relationship with discomfort. Motivation often collapses not at the point of physical difficulty but at the point of emotional discomfort, particularly when effort triggers feelings of incompetence, comparison, or vulnerability. If discomfort is interpreted as danger, your nervous system will downregulate pursuit signals to protect you. But if discomfort is reframed as expected friction in the learning curve, it loses its threatening quality. This reframing is not positive thinking, it is predictive accuracy. Growth inherently involves temporary incompetence, and if you expect early imperfection, the reward prediction error diminishes because reality matches forecast. Unrealistic timelines are one of the most common sources of motivational collapse. When you compress a long developmental process into an emotionally charged short horizon, you create inevitable disappointment. Expanding your timeline reduces pressure, and reduced pressure lowers emotional cost, which stabilizes dopamine signaling. Patience is not passive, it is strategic recalibration of expectation. Another dimension involves environmental design. Your environment either amplifies or dampens friction, and friction accumulates invisibly. If tools are disorganized, if distractions are accessible, if cues are inconsistent, your cognitive load increases, and with it the effort required to initiate action. Simplifying your environment reduces initiation cost, making behavior more automatic. Automatic behaviors require less motivational fuel because they bypass extended deliberation. Consider how brushing your teeth really requires inspiration. It is anchored to a routine, cued by context, and reinforced by immediate completion. When meaningful goals are integrated into predictable cues, they borrow stability from existing habits. Habit stacking, environmental cues, and pre-commitment devices all function by narrowing the decision window and limiting the brain's opportunity to renegotiate. Renegotiation is where motivation dies. The moment you begin bargaining with yourself about whether to act, the emotional cost increases, and if cost exceeds predicted reward, avoidance wins. By reducing negotiation space, you reduce variability. There is also power in redefining discipline. Discipline is often framed as forcing yourself to do what you do not want to do, but sustainable discipline is more accurately described as protecting long-term identity from short-term impulses. It is less about aggression toward yourself and more about clarity regarding who you're becoming. When clarity increases, conflict decreases. Much of what people call lack of motivation is actually unresolved internal conflict between competing identities, the comfort-seeking self and the growth-oriented self, the present-focused self and the future-oriented self. If you do not consciously decide which identity has authority, the conflict drains energy. Authority is established through consistent small votes cast for the chosen identity. Each action is a vote, and while a single vote is insignificant, the accumulation defines the outcome. This voting metaphor reduces pressure because it acknowledges imperfection. Missing one action does not destroy identity, but repeated votes in one direction solidify it. Perfectionism is another hidden motivation killer. When you equate consistency with flawlessness, you raise the cost of imperfection so high that minor deviations trigger disproportionate discouragement. This discouragement magnifies reward prediction error because your internal standard was unrealistic. Adopting a minimum viable standard, a floor rather than a ceiling, ensures continuity even on suboptimal days. Continuity matters more than intensity. Intensity fluctuates naturally. Continuity builds identity. Over time, continuity reshapes self-concept so thoroughly that the behaviors you once struggled to initiate become default expressions of who you are. At that stage, motivation feels less like a spark and more like momentum. Momentum is different from motivation. Motivation is emotional activation. Momentum is accumulated evidence in motion. Momentum reduces initiation cost because the behavior is already underway. The hardest part of any endeavor is often the beginning, and by designing systems that make beginning small and automatic, you bypass the steepest resistance point. As you accumulate momentum, your brain updates its prediction that continued action is likely, which increases confidence and reduces internal skepticism. Confidence, in this context, is not bravado, it is accurate prediction of self-follow-through. When you trust yourself to act even without feeling inspired, you no longer panic when motivation dips. The dip becomes expected, temporary, and manageable. Ultimately, losing motivation quickly was never the real problem. The real problem was misinterpreting the dip as a verdict on your character rather than as feedback on your system. When you separate identity from temporary emotional states, when you calibrate expectations to realistic timelines, when you design reinforcement loops that reward process rather than distant outcomes, and when you build reliability through small, repeatable actions, motivation stops being something you chase and starts being something that emerges intermittently to amplify an already stable structure. You do not need constant motivation to achieve meaningful progress. You need clarity, calibration, and consistency. Once those are in place, the disappearance of motivation no longer signals failure. It simply signals that the initial emotional surge has completed its role, and the deeper work of identity-driven action has begun.